The call came in the middle of the night, as it always does. I had been struggling with insomnia for weeks, my sleep patterns disrupted by nightmares that seemed to seep into reality. The phone's sudden ring was jarring, slicing through the silence of my darkened bedroom. I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. The caller ID showed an unknown number, one that I didn't recognize. I hesitated for a moment, the unsettling feeling that had become a constant companion creeping up my spine. I picked up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. "Hello," I said, trying to mask the weariness in my voice. The line crackled, and for a few seconds, there was only silence. Then, a voice began to speak, a voice that was chillingly familiar. "Hi there," the voice said, its tone eerily calm. "I was wondering if you remembered me." I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It belonged to someone I had known years ago, someone I had thought was long gone from my life. It was the voice of Adrian, a friend from my college days who had vanished without a trace. His disappearance had been the subject of much speculation and gossip, but no one had ever discovered what had happened to him. "Adrian," I stammered, disbelief mingling with fear. "Is that really you?" "Yes," the voice replied. "It's me. I need to talk to you." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in shock, my heart pounding. I tried to call back, but the number was disconnected. I sat in the darkness, my mind racing. Was this a prank? Some kind of cruel joke? Or was there something more sinister at play? The next morning, I found myself unable to shake the unease from the night before. I decided to investigate further. I went through old contacts and found Adrian's family. They were as shocked as I was, claiming they hadn't heard from him in years. His parents had moved away, and no one knew where he might be. The sense of dread grew heavier, a weight pressing down on me as I delved into his past. As the days passed, the calls continued. They came at all hours, always from unknown numbers. Each time, the voice on the other end was the same, calm, collected, and hauntingly familiar. Adrian would say a few cryptic words and then hang up, leaving me with a gnawing sense of dread and confusion. The conversations never made sense, but they always left me with a lingering feeling of unease. One evening, after a particularly unsettling call, I noticed something strange. The walls of my apartment seemed to be closing in on me, the rooms feeling smaller and more oppressive. I heard faint, disjointed whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound was maddening, a constant buzz in the back of my mind. That night, the whispers grew louder, and I felt an inexplicable compulsion to follow them. I wandered through my apartment, tracing the sound until it led me to an old forgotten box I had kept in the back of my closet. It was filled with old photographs, letters, and mementos from years past. As I sifted through the items, I found a photograph of Adrian. He was standing in front of a house that I vaguely recognized, a house I had visited once during college, now long forgotten in the recesses of my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows in my apartment seemed to move and shift, and the whispers grew more frantic. I decided to visit the house from the photograph, hoping to find some clue that would explain the bizarre phone calls and the growing sense of dread. The house was located on the outskirts of town, isolated and overgrown with weeds. It was a dilapidated old place, its paint peeling and windows shattered. The air around it felt heavy, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I hesitated at the entrance, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. Inside, the house was a decaying relic of a past long forgotten. The floors creaked under my weight, and the walls were covered in mold and grime. I moved cautiously through the rooms, each one more derelict than the last. The house seemed to have a life of its own, its very presence suffused with an oppressive sense of malice. I eventually found myself in the basement, a dark, musty space filled with old furniture and broken items. As I explored, I discovered a small door hidden behind a stack of old crates. The door was partially ajar, and an unsettling chill emanated from within. I pushed it open and descended into a narrow, pitch-black tunnel. The tunnel was damp and claustrophobic, the walls lined with old, rotting wood. I followed the passage, my flashlight flickering as I went. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, seeming to come from all directions. My heart raced, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. At the end of the tunnel, I found a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, its legs bound with thick, rusty chains. Next to the chair was a table covered with various objects, photographs, old books, and a single flickering candle. The room was filled with a faint, acrid smell, and the air felt charged with a dark, malevolent energy. On the wall, scrawled in what appeared to be dried blood, were several phrases, disturbing, incoherent messages that seemed to speak of torment and despair. My flashlight revealed more chilling details. A series of photographs pinned to the wall, each showing a person in various stages of distress, their faces twisted in terror. One of the photographs was of Adrian, his eyes wide with fear, a look of pure anguish etched on his face. I felt a sudden, intense cold, and the whispers turned into anguished cries. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pulsating with a dark, suffocating presence. I turned to leave, but the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in a maddening maze. I stumbled out of the tunnel, my mind reeling from the experience. The house felt more oppressive than ever, the darkness closing in around me. I fled the building, the sense of dread following me all the way back to my apartment. The phone calls continued, more urgent and frantic than before, each one leaving me more terrified than the last. Desperate for answers, I sought help from a local paranormal investigator. They examined the house and the tunnel but found no concrete evidence of supernatural activity. They suggested that the disturbances could be the result of my own heightened anxiety and stress, but their words did little to soothe my growing terror. The phone calls eventually stopped, but the sense of unease never left. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, haunted by the memories of the house and the disturbing revelations I had uncovered. The photographs, the messages on the walls, and the anguished cries still lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken hold of my life. In the end, I moved away, leaving behind the apartment and the house on the outskirts of town. But the nightmares persisted, and the feeling of being watched never fully faded. I remained haunted by the calls, the images, and the sense of dread that had taken over my life. The darkness that had once been confined to a decaying house now seemed to follow me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the malevolent force that had once reached out through the phone lines and into my world. I've always thought working the night shift at a hospital would be a little creepy, but after the first few months, I got used to it. I figured that after hearing the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional distant beeping of machines, the silence would settle into me like it did for everyone else. The stillness became a companion. After all, it was just me, the patients, and the subtle rhythm of the ICU, until the whistling started. I remember the first night I heard it like it was yesterday. It was around 3 a.m., the hour when everything was as calm as it gets. The ward was quiet, and I was doing my rounds. I was standing at the nurse's station, filling out charts, when I noticed it. A soft, distant tune, barely audible at first. Took me a moment to even realize it was whistling. Just a simple, slow melody, like someone idly whistling a tune to themselves while they walked. I thought maybe one of the other nurses was playing a prank, or perhaps the patient was awake, wandering the halls. I didn't think much of it then, just a brief distraction. But over the next few nights, I heard it again, always at the same time, just past 3 a.m., right when the night seemed the deepest. It was odd, though. The whistling wasn't coming from anywhere near the nurse's station. It was always down the hallway, near the ICU where the sickest patients were kept. There was never anyone around when I checked, and no one on the staff admitted to hearing it. Some of them laughed when I mentioned it, saying it was probably just one of the patients. I even joked about it myself for a while, trying to brush off the growing unease gnawing at my stomach. But then things started to get weirder. The whistling was getting louder, clearer, as if whoever or whatever was whistling was getting closer. I could hear the tune more distinctly now, though it was still unfamiliar. It was repetitive, like a song that had gotten stuck in someone's head for far too long. One night, as I stood alone at the station, I decided to wait for it. I didn't want to leave my post again to chase shadows, so I stayed put, determined to figure out where the sound was coming from. At 3:05, like clockwork, the whistling began. It echoed down the hallway, the eerie melody drifting toward me in the quiet. I held my breath, listening. It was getting louder, closer this time. Couldn't resist. I grabbed my flashlight and walked slowly down the hall, my shoes squeaking on the polished floor. The whistling didn't stop as I approached the ICU. If anything, it grew louder, as though the source was just around the next corner. My pulse quickened as I turned into the long, dimly lit corridor. It was empty. Of course it was. The whistling had stopped abruptly, like whoever was making the sound had seen me coming and vanished. I stood there for a minute, my heart thudding in my chest, scanning the rows of dark rooms. Most of the patients were asleep except for one, an elderly man in room 309. He had been in a coma for weeks, barely clinging to life. I had a strange urge to look in on him, though I had already checked on him earlier that night. I peered through the window of his door. He was lying still, just as I had left him, the ventilator hissing softly as it kept him breathing. But something was different. The air felt thick, oppressive. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild in the quiet night. But deep down, I felt it. Something wasn't right. The next night, I was determined to put this whole thing to rest. I told one of the senior nurses about the whistling, hoping she'd give me some logical explanation. Maybe the vents were making the noise, or some weird draft was carrying sounds from another part of the hospital. She gave me a strange look when I mentioned it, like she knew something she wasn't telling me. "You heard it too?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt a chill creep down my spine. "What do you mean? You've heard it before?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the clock. "It was nearly 3 a.m. There's an old story," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "A few years ago, before you started working here, there was a patient, an older man. He used to whistle that same tune every night, right before he died." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "And you think it's him?" She shrugged, but her face had gone pale. "All I know is that after he passed, people started hearing it. Some of the nurses quit over it, said it followed them home. But the strangest part is the whistling always seemed to happen when someone in the ICU was close to. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat. That night, I didn't want to believe her. Couldn't. But the next few nights shattered any doubt I had. The whistling was getting louder, more insistent, and every time I heard it, it seemed to come from just outside room 309, the old man's room. His condition had been declining steadily, and I had this sick feeling that the whistling was for him, like a death knell. One night, I was alone in the ICU, filling out some paperwork, when the whistling began again. This time it was right outside the door. My blood ran cold as the melody echoed in my ears, clearer than it had ever been before. I slowly stood up, my legs shaky, and walked to the door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, but the whistling hadn't stopped. It was louder now, coming from inside room 309. I stepped into the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The old man was still lying in his bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular breaths. The room was dark, except for the soft glow of the machines keeping him alive. And then I heard it, soft, ragged, but unmistakable. The whistling was coming from him. His lips were slightly parted, and that eerie, repetitive tune was escaping from his mouth, even though he was unconscious. I froze, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. The sound grew louder, filling the room, pressing in on me from all sides. The old man's eyes were still closed, his body motionless, but the whistling continued, relentless. Suddenly, the machine started beeping, his heart rate was dropping. I should have called for help, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from his face. The whistling grew fainter as his breathing slowed, until finally, it stopped. He was gone. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking, my mind racing. The whistling had stopped, but something inside me knew it wasn't over. The following nights were unbearable. Every time 3 a.m. rolled around, I could hear it again, the whistling. But now it wasn't just in the ICU. It followed me everywhere I went. In the hallways, at the nurse's station, even in the break room. The tune was always the same, growing louder and louder, as if whoever was making it was right behind me. I quit my job a week later. I couldn't take it anymore. But even now, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet and still, sometimes I hear it, the whistling. And I know it's not done with me yet. The clock ticked slowly as I sat at the reception desk of the small hospital. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting a sterile glow over the empty waiting room. It was a Friday night, and I had taken the graveyard shift. The hospital was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt eerie and heavy, amplifying every sound. As a medical receptionist, I was used to long nights, but this one felt different. An unsettling tension lingered in the air. I stared at the clock, counting down the hours until my shift would end. My shift partner had left at midnight, and I was now alone. The only other person in the building was a night nurse who occasionally stopped by to check on me. But otherwise, I was isolated in the dim light of the reception area. At around 2 a.m., the phone rang, cutting through the silence. I jumped slightly, startled by the sound. It was unusual for someone to call this late. Most patients were admitted in person, and the phone rarely rang at this hour. I hesitated, glancing around the empty room before answering. "Hospital reception. How may I help you?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was silence on the other end, a long pause that felt unnaturally heavy. "Hello," I prompted, feeling my heart rate quicken. "Is this the hospital?" A shaky voice finally replied. It was a woman, her voice trembling and breathy. "Yes, it is," I responded, trying to sound reassuring. "What's your emergency?" "I need help," she said, her words punctuated by panic breaths. "I don't know where I am, but I'm hurt. Can you tell me your location?" I asked, my mind racing. "I'll send someone to you." "No," she cried, her voice rising in fear. "They'll find me. Please, just listen." A chill ran down my spine. The urgency in her voice was unsettling. "Okay, I'm listening. Just take a deep breath and tell me what happened." "I was out with friends and I don't know. I got separated from them. I think someone is following me. Where were you last? I pressed, trying to keep her calm. I was at the park. The one near the old factory, she said, her voice breaking. I thought I saw someone watching me. I ran and then I fell. Are you injured? I asked. I think I twisted my ankle. It hurts, but I'm more scared of them finding me. Okay, listen to me, I said, trying to keep my own fear at bay. I'm going to get help. Stay on the line with me. Please hurry, she begged, her voice trembling. Stay calm, I urged, my heart pounding in my chest. I'll get you help. Can you see any landmarks? Anything that might help us find you? There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing, ragged and panicked. There's a big tree and some old swings. I think it's by the creek. Good. Stay near the tree. I'm gonna call 911 right now, I said, fumbling for the phone. No, she shouted, her voice rising in panic. Don't call them. They'll come for me. Why? I asked, confused. Why would they come for you? I don't know. Just please, don't call anyone. My instinct screamed at me to ignore her request, but something in her voice, something desperate and terrified, made me hesitate. Okay, I said, I won't call. Just tell me what to do. Just stay on the line, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need to know you're with me. I'm here, I assured her, gripping the phone tightly. The silence hung heavy between us, each second stretching into eternity. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound in the background, followed by a muffled voice. I sat up straight, my heart racing. What's happening? I asked, my voice urgent. I think they found me, she whispered, panic flooding her tone. Oh God, I can't breathe. Stay with me, I said, my heart pounding. Where are you? By the tree. I can see them, she gasped. They're coming. The line went dead. Hello, I shouted into the phone, but there was only silence. My heart raced as I frantically redialed the number, but all I got was a busy signal. Panic washed over me. What had just happened? Had she been hurt? Was she in danger? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't sit here doing nothing. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, my heart leaping as I saw a text notification from the hospital's emergency line. Emergency services are on their way. Wait for them to arrive. I quickly typed back, explaining the situation and the woman's last known location. I grabbed my keys and hurried to my car, my mind racing as I drove through the empty streets. The park was only a few miles away. I had to reach her before it was too late. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead, but the night felt suffocating and heavy. When I arrived at the park, I parked the car and rushed toward the entrance. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. My heart pounded as I stepped onto the path, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet echoing in the silence. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. Are you here? I strained to hear any response, but only silence greeted me. My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it, focusing on the shadows in the distance. I made my way toward the big tree, the one she had described. Can you hear me? I shouted, my voice carrying into the night. I'm here to help. Nothing. Just as I was about to turn back, I spotted movement out of the corner of my eye. I squinted into the darkness, straining to see anything. Is anyone there? Then, from behind the tree, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face hidden in the shadows. My heart sank. Are you looking for someone? He asked, his voice low and menacing. Who are you? I demanded, stepping back instinctively. Just someone passing through, he said, taking a step closer. What's your business here? I asked, my voice rising. I'm looking for a girl, he said, She called the hospital. She was hurt. He chuckled softly, an unsettling sound that sent chills down my spine. Oh, I wouldn't worry about her. She's fine. Where is she? I demanded, my voice rising in panic. Let's just say she won't be going anywhere for a while, he said, his expression unreadable. What did you do to her? He took another step closer, and I felt a surge of fear. Nothing. She didn't ask for you. You should turn around and leave before things get messy. I shook my head, backing away slowly. I'm calling the police. He laughed. A dark, twisted sound. You think they'll help? You think anyone is coming for you? My heart raced as I turned to run back to my car. I sprinted down the path, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I pushed myself to run faster. Just as I reached my car, I glanced back, but he was gone. I jumped inside, slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but I knew I couldn't wait. I had to find her. I drove back to the tree, my heart pounding in my chest as I parked the car. I noticed a figure lying on the ground near the tree. I rushed out, dread pooling in my stomach as I approached. It was her, the woman from the phone call. Oh God, I gasped, kneeling beside her. Are you okay? She was unconscious, a bruise forming on her temple, and her ankle was swollen. I checked for a pulse. My heart raced with fear. It was weak but steady. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by panic. Help! I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty park. Somebody, please help. I pulled out my phone and called 911 again. But before I could explain, the same man I had seen earlier emerged from the shadows. Look who we have here, he said, a sinister smile on his face. Stay away, I shouted, scrambling to protect the woman. You're too late, sweetheart. She's mine now. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I stood up, my instincts screaming at me to fight. You won't take her, I shouted, my voice filled with determination. He stepped closer, his expression darkening. You don't understand what you're dealing with. But before he could reach me, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached. The man hesitated, glancing around as the lights flashed through the trees. This isn't over, he hissed before disappearing into the shadows. Moments later, the police arrived, and I rushed to them, pointing toward the woman on the ground. She needs help. Call an ambulance. The officers quickly took control, checking on her as I stood back, my heart racing. I watched as they called for paramedics, feeling a mix of relief and dread as the ambulance pulled up. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I had survived a night of fear and uncertainty, but the darkness still lingered in my mind. Hours later, after everything had calmed down, I sat in the hospital waiting room, watching the paramedics wheel the woman away. I hoped she would be okay, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. What had I just witnessed? I realized I had entered a nightmare, one that felt all too real. As I stared into the distance, my phone buzzed again with a text from the hospital's emergency line. Please stay alert. We believe there may be a threat in the area. The terror sank deep into my bones, and I knew that this wasn't over. I've been working as a night shift security guard for almost 5 years now. I'm not exactly what you'd call a thrill seeker, but the job pays the bills, and it's usually pretty quiet. That's exactly why I took it. Most people don't realize just how still things get during the night, especially in a place that's been abandoned for years. The factory I guard hasn't been operational for over a decade, but for some reason, They still need security to watch the place. Vandalism, they say, but it's not like people are breaking in all the time. It's more like I'm guarding ghosts, which now I think might not be far from the truth. This old factory is enormous. When it was running, it must have been a booming place. But now it's just crumbling brick walls and the quiet hum of the few remaining lights that haven't gone out. There's a maze of empty corridors, storage rooms, and cavernous spaces where the machines used to churn. When I first started, I'd walk the whole building at least once a night just to pass the time. But recently, I've stuck to the security room, keeping an eye on the cameras. It wasn't laziness or boredom that kept me from my rounds. No, it was because of what I started seeing in the footage. It all started a few months ago on a typical night. I was sipping coffee, glancing at the camera feeds like usual. Most of them showed nothing but empty rooms, dust-covered machines, and the occasional flicker of a dying light. But then one of the monitors caught my eye. In the corner of the old break room, there was a shadow. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just a trick of the poor lighting. But this shadow wasn't like the others. It didn't move with the flicker of the light. It didn't shift with the angle of the camera. It stood perfectly still. I leaned in closer, staring at the screen. The break room was supposed to be empty. It always was. No one ever went in there. But this shadow, it was shaped like a person, like someone just standing there in the corner, watching. I scanned the other cameras quickly, expecting to see someone walking around. Maybe a prankster or a homeless guy who had somehow wandered inside. But there was no one else. The building was completely empty, as it always was. I switched back to the break room camera. The shadow was still there. It was unnerving, but I didn't want to freak myself out over nothing. It had to be some kind of optical illusion, a pile of junk, or maybe a broken part of the wall. The lighting in that room was terrible, after all. I made a mental note to check it out on my next round, but for the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next night, I walked down to the break room. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but it was completely empty, just as it had always been. There was no shadow, no strange figure standing in the corner. Just an old, dusty table and a couple of chairs that hadn't been used in years. I breathed a sigh of relief, laughing at myself for getting worked up over a trick of the light. Still, something felt off about that room. The air was thick, heavy, and colder than the rest of the factory. It was probably the draft from the broken windows, I told myself, but I left quickly, not wanting to linger. That night, back in the security room, I checked the cameras again. My heart stopped when I saw it. The shadow was back, same spot, same corner. It was almost like it had never left. I stared at the monitor for what felt like an eternity, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. My hands shook as I flipped through the other camera feeds. Nothing. There was nothing anywhere else in the building. No movement, no signs of life. Just that damn shadow in the break room. I didn't know what to do. Call the cops? Tell them that a shadow was scaring me? They'd laugh in my face. So I did nothing. I just sat there, staring at the screen, the cold sweat running down my back. Over the next few nights, things got worse. The shadow wasn't just standing in the corner anymore. It was moving slowly, barely noticeable at first, but I could see it. It would shift from one side of the room to the other, like it was pacing, restless. And it wasn't just confined to the break room anymore. I started seeing it in other parts of the factory, first in the hallways, then in the old storage rooms. Always just out of sight, always lurking in the dark corners where the light didn't reach. No matter how many times I checked, I could never catch it in person. It was only on the cameras and only at night. I started dreading my shifts. The isolation that I had once found comforting now felt suffocating. I wasn't alone in that factory. I could feel it watching me every second of every night. I stopped doing rounds completely. I couldn't bear the thought of walking those empty halls. Not with that thing lurking somewhere in the dark. I barely slept during the day. My mind was constantly racing, replaying the images from the cameras over and over again, trying to make sense of it. But there was no sense to it. No logic. Just terror. One night, about a week after I first saw the shadow, I came into work with a plan. I brought a flashlight, a good one, and decided I was going to confront it. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe if I saw it with my own eyes, it would disappear. So I waited. The first hour passed uneventfully. Then 2. At exactly 3 a.m., there it was again on the screen, the shadow standing in the corner of the break room, perfectly still. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and walked toward the room. The factory was silent, except for the occasional groan of the old building settling. My footsteps echoed against the concrete floors as I made my way down the hall. The closer I got to the break room, the heavier the air felt, like something was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. My hand shook as I gripped the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness ahead of me. I stopped outside the door to the break room. The lights inside flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. At first, everything seemed normal, just the same old empty room. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The shadow. It was in the corner just like it had been on the cameras, but now I was seeing it with my own eyes. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there watching me, waiting. I wanted to run, to turn and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead. Slowly, I raised the flashlight and pointed it toward the corner. Nothing happened. The light didn't reveal anything. The shadow was still there, dark and impenetrable, like the light couldn't touch it. It was as if it existed outside of the physical world, something not bound by the rules of reality. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it shift slightly, as if it was aware of me now, acknowledging my presence. Then it moved, not quickly, but deliberately, like it was sizing me up. The shadow detached itself from the corner, stretching out along the walls, growing larger as it crept toward me. I stumbled back, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep the flashlight steady. The beam flickered, the battery struggling, as the darkness inched closer. I backed into the door, fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My fingers were slick with sweat, slipping off the metal as the shadow loomed closer. It was right in front of me now, a towering mass of darkness that swallowed the light. I could feel the cold emanating from it, seeping into my skin, freezing me to the bone. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body frozen in place. The air around me seemed to ripple, like something was trying to push through. And then I heard it, a whisper, low, guttural, incomprehensible. The sound wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the shadow. It was speaking to me, but I couldn't understand the words. They were twisted, distorted, like a voice from another world. The shadow began to stretch, elongating along the walls, pressing closer and closer until it seemed to merge with the very fabric of the room itself. My vision blurred, and for a second, I thought I was losing consciousness. Just before everything went black, I saw something in the heart of that shadow. A face, pale and distorted, twisted in a grotesque smile. Its hollow eyes locked on mine. When I woke up, I was back in the security room. The cameras were showing nothing out of the ordinary, just empty rooms, quiet halls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That shadow, whatever it was still there, lurking in the corners, waiting. I quit the job the next morning, but even now I can feel it. The shadow never left. It's always watching me, from the darkest corners of my home, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. I haven't slept in weeks, and when I close my eyes, I see that face, that twisted, smiling face, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes back for me. I had taken the night shift at the warehouse for extra cash. It was a dull job, surrounded by towering stacks of boxes and the hum of fluorescent lights that buzzed above. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I preferred it. Working nights meant fewer interruptions, a chance to focus on the task without the distractions of the day crew. But that first night, I sensed something was off. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of town, a sprawling structure that had seen better days. There were stories about it being haunted, something about a worker who had gone missing decades ago, but I dismissed them as urban legends. As the clock struck midnight, I settled into my routine, checking inventory and logging details on my clipboard. The only sounds were the occasional creaking of the building and the distant rumble of traffic on the nearby highway. It was monotonous, a rhythm I could easily fall into. But as the hours wore on, I began to notice a presence. At first, it was just a feeling, like someone was watching me. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that I was just tired. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like the shuffle of footsteps echoing through the empty aisles. I paused, holding my breath, listening intently. It could have been the wind, or perhaps the old building settling, but my instinct screamed that it was something more. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned the corner into a narrow aisle between the stacks of boxes, shining the beam of light ahead. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing against the metal shelves. Silence. I stepped further into the aisle, my footsteps muted against the concrete floor. The light from my flashlight illuminated the boxes, casting long shadows that danced around me. Just as I was about to turn back, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the far end of the aisle. My heart raced as I directed the light toward the movement. Nothing. I cursed under my breath, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. Definitely footsteps this time. Closer. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking slightly. Nothing but silence answered me. I decided to head back to the office, shaking off the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I was not alone. As I entered the office, I locked the door behind me, a small comfort in the solitude of the night. Minutes turned into hours, and my mind began to wander. I focused on the paperwork, pushing away the unease. Then the overhead lights flickered. I glanced up, frowning. It was probably a sign that they needed maintenance, but my heart raced nonetheless. The quiet was suffocating. I poured myself a cup of lukewarm coffee, hoping the caffeine would shake off the impending dread. I settled into my chair, trying to immerse myself in the inventory logs. Just as I began to find my rhythm again, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. I jolted upright, adrenaline surging through me. I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside the office, my pulse quickening. The noise had come from the loading dock area. I approached cautiously, shining the light ahead, my heart pounding with each step. As I neared the loading dock, I spotted a box lying on the floor, its contents scattered. I sighed in relief. It was just a box that had fallen. But as I bent down to pick it up, I noticed something strange. The label on the box was different from the others, not matching the inventory I had checked earlier. I brushed off my nerves, reminding myself that I was alone and safe. But the hairs on my neck stood on end as I glanced around the dimly lit area, feeling that same unsettling sensation wash over me. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. But just as I was about to stand, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, but this time behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice wavering. Nothing. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. My heart raced as I caught a glimpse of a figure darting behind a stack of boxes. "Hey, show yourself," I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty space. No response. I felt my breath quickening, panic rising within me. I took a cautious step forward, my pulse racing. "This isn't funny," I called out, but the only answer was silence. I decided it was time to call for help. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I fished it out, my fingers trembling as I dialed. But just as I pressed the call button, the lights flickered again and went out, plunging me into darkness. My heart raced as I tried to steady my breath. I clicked my flashlight on, the beam cutting through the pitch black. The warehouse was eerily silent, the sound of my breathing echoing in my ears. I glanced around, the shadows looming ominously. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me, and the fear started to claw at my mind. Then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time right behind me. I spun around, shining the light in every direction, but there was nothing, just empty shelves and darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice thick with fear, but the silence was deafening. I turned and sprinted back toward the office, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear footsteps behind me, echoing against the concrete floor. I burst into the office and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to calm myself. I fumbled for my phone to call 911, but it slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor. "Damn it!" I cursed, scrambling to pick it up. Just as I grabbed it, I heard a knock on the door. My heart stopped. "Hello?" A voice called out. It was muffled, indistinct, but it sent chills down my spine. "Who is it?" I shouted, my voice shaky. There was no response, just silence. I glanced at the door, the cold metal handle gleaming in the beam of my flashlight. I felt trapped, and the weight of the darkness pressed in on me. I had to know what was happening. Summoning all my courage, I took a step back from the door. "If you're playing a prank, it's not funny." Silence. Then the knocking started again, more insistent this time. "Let me in," the voice urged, low and haunting. I stepped back, my heart racing. I knew I shouldn't open the door, but something about that voice made my skin crawl. "I'll call the police," I shouted, hoping to scare whoever it was away. "Please," the voice begged, sounding desperate. "I need help." The plea resonated in my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a trap. My instinct screamed at me to stay put, to not give in to the unknown. "I'm calling 911, I said, my voice trembling. "No, you don't understand." Before I could respond, I heard a loud crack against the door, shaking the frame. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through me. "Stop!" I yelled, my heart racing as I grabbed a nearby chair, ready to defend myself. But the knocking stopped, and I was left in silence once more, the fear palpable in the air. I stood frozen, listening intently, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I was about to let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the office in stark white light. I took a cautious step forward, the chair still gripped tightly in my hands. "What's going on?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness, but there was no answer. I cautiously approached the door, my heart racing. I had to know if whoever it was still there. "Hello? Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence greeted me. I reached for the door handle, my heart pounding. "If you're still there, say something," but nothing. With trembling hands, I slowly turned the handle and opened the door a crack, peering into the hallway. The warehouse was empty, the shadows dancing eerily along the walls. I stepped out, my heart racing as I scanned the area. "Hello," I called, but only the sound of my voice echoed back. Taking a deep breath, I stepped further into the aisle, shining my flashlight ahead. I moved cautiously, acutely aware of every sound. The hum of the overhead lights, the faint rustling of boxes, and the distant sound of my own heartbeat. As I made my way toward the loading dock, I spotted something on the floor, a dark stain spreading out from behind a stack of boxes. My stomach twisted as I approached, the flashlight beam illuminating a broken bottle and a small puddle of dark liquid that looked suspiciously like blood. I stepped back, panic surging through me. "What the hell?" I muttered, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I turned to leave, but then I heard it again, the footsteps, closer this time, echoing in the shadows. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear, but no one answered. My hand gripped the flashlight tighter, my mind spinning with terror. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, stalking me through the empty warehouse. I had to leave. I had to get out now. I ran back toward the office, the footsteps echoing behind me, and didn't stop until I had the door locked again. My heart was racing, and I couldn't seem to catch my breath. I collapsed against the door, trembling, my mind spinning. What was happening? Was I imagining things? Or was there something, or someone, lurking in the shadows? The darkness outside the door seemed to press in on me, the unknown waiting just beyond the thin barrier. I had to get out, but something told me that whatever I had heard tonight, whatever was lurking in the shadows, didn't want me to leave. Working as a night janitor at an office building isn't the worst job in the world. In fact, I used to enjoy the quiet of it. There's a strange kind of peace in being the only person in a massive building, cleaning up after the chaos of the workday. People might think it's lonely, but I never minded it. At least not until recently. I've been working at this particular office building for almost 2 years. It's one of those big, modern glass and steel constructions in the city center. Open floor plans, sleek furniture, and fluorescent lights that never seem to fully turn off. During the day, the place is buzzing with people. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, the hum of dozens of conversations happening at once. But at night, it's silent. That kind of deep, oppressive silence that presses down on you, making every little sound echo like a gunshot. I usually start my shift around 9 p.m., right after the last of the day staff have left. I go from floor to floor, vacuuming, taking out the trash, wiping down desks and windows. It's routine work. There's never been anything weird or unsettling about it. Until a few weeks ago. It started with small things. Nothing too concerning at first. I clean a room, step out to grab something, and when I'd return, things would be slightly out of place. A chair pulled out when I knew I'd pushed it in. A computer screen turned on when I was sure it had been off. At first, I thought I was just tired or being careless. Working nights can mess with your head after a while, make you see things that aren't really there. I brushed it off as just that, my mind playing tricks on me. But then things started getting stranger. One night, I was cleaning the break room on the 3rd floor. It was a pretty standard room. Coffee machine, fridge, microwave, a few tables and chairs. I was wiping down the counters when I heard a soft sound behind me, like a chair scraping against the floor. I turned around, expecting to see one of the chairs had shifted, but everything was exactly where I'd left it. The room was empty, silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I stood there for a moment listening, but there was nothing. I went back to cleaning, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. But just as I was about to leave, I heard it again, a faint dragging sound. This time I spun around immediately. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, but everything was still. I walked over to the chairs, touching each one, making sure they were all secure. They hadn't moved. I laughed it off, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The sound must have been coming from another floor, or maybe it was just the building settling. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Over the next few nights, the strange noises became more frequent. Footsteps echoing in the halls when I knew I was the only one there. Whispers just on the edge of my hearing, doors creaking open and closing on their own. I even started hearing faint typing, like someone was working late, tapping away at a keyboard, though I knew for a fact no one was in the office after hours. One night, as I was vacuuming the 4th floor, I heard the elevator ding down the hall. This wasn't unusual on its own. Sometimes maintenance workers would come in late, or maybe security was doing their rounds. But this was different. The building has one elevator, and it's loud old. You can hear it moving between floors, but that night, I didn't hear it moving. I just heard the ding, like the doors had opened and closed right outside the floor. I turned off the vacuum and walked over to the hallway. The elevator doors were shut. The panel didn't show any floor numbers being called. But as I stood there, staring at the doors, I heard a soft, unmistakable sigh. The sound came from behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. I stood there for a few moments, frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence was deafening, like the entire building was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, but when I looked down the hall, there was no one there. After that, I started avoiding the 4th floor as much as I could. Something about it felt wrong. The air was always colder there, the lights flickering more than on the other floors. Every time I stepped off the elevator onto that floor, I felt a sense of dread settle over me, like I was walking into a place I wasn't supposed to be. A week later, I was mopping the floors in one of the conference rooms on the 6th floor. It was almost 2 a.m. and I was exhausted. I had just finished up and was about to head back to the janitor's closet when I heard the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping across the floor behind me. I froze. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned around, my heart racing. One of the chairs at the conference table had been pulled out, though I hadn't touched it. It was positioned as if someone had just sat down, but the room was empty. I stared at the chair for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe I'd bumped it without realizing it. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and my memory was playing tricks on me. But I knew that wasn't true. I hadn't touched the chair. As I stood there, the silence in the room grew thicker, almost oppressive. And then I heard it, the soft click of keys being pressed, like someone typing on a keyboard. But there were no computers in the conference room, no desks, no devices, just the empty table and chairs. The sound grew louder, more frantic, like someone was typing faster and faster. My heart pounded in my chest, and I backed toward the door, trying to keep my eyes on the room. But the moment I turned to leave, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, low, hoarse, almost a whisper. "Don't leave." I bolted. I ran down the hall, my footsteps echoing off the walls, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was in the stairwell, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat down on the steps, trying to calm myself, but my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in that building. The next night, I seriously considered quitting. I'd seen enough horror movies to know where this was going, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what was lurking in those dark, empty offices. But I needed the money, and I convinced myself that maybe I was just stressed, maybe sleep deprived. I'd been working a lot of hours, after all. But that night, things escalated. I was cleaning the bathrooms on the 5th floor when I heard the elevator ding again. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I knew no one was supposed to be there. It was past midnight, and the building was locked up tight. But the elevator dinged again, and then again, as if someone was riding it up and down, stopping at every floor. I stepped out into the hall and looked toward the elevator. The doors were closed, but the panel showed that it was on the 5th floor with me. My stomach churned with a sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that elevator wasn't human. As I stood there staring at the doors, they slowly began to open. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back. The elevator was empty, but the light inside flickered ominously. And then I saw it, just for a second, barely visible in the flickering light. A figure standing at the back of the elevator, shrouded in shadow. I blinked, and it was gone. The doors closed with a soft hiss, and I stood there, my heart racing, my skin cold and clammy. I knew then that something was seriously wrong with this building. Something that couldn't be explained by tiredness or stress. That night, as I finished up my shift, I heard the typing again. But this time, it wasn't just in one room. It was everywhere. Every floor I went to, I could hear the faint sound of fingers tapping away at keyboards, echoing through the empty halls. But there were no lights on, no computers running, no people, just me. And then, as I was gathering my things to leave, I heard the voice again. That same low, rasping whisper. Don't leave. I quit the next morning. I told myself I'd find another job. One that didn't involve working alone at night in a haunted building. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I'm alone, I hear those faint whispers, the sound of keys clacking, the scrape of a chair moving behind me. And I know it's not over. Whatever was in that building has followed me, and it's waiting for the right moment to make itself known.